Imagine for a moment that you could forgive everyone who ever hurt you in your life, that you could let go of all your resentment towards anyone who ever harmed you. Now imagine for a moment that you were forgiven by everyone who ever hurt you, for anything you ever did to harm anyone. You can call it grace or atonement or unconditional love. Just the thought of it touches some better place within us. We all know the healing power of forgiveness from our personal lives, even in our small forgiveness experiences. A mother's forgiving words when we were children and broke that special vase, and those words affect our parenting to this very day. A colleague we forgive for undermining us at work that leads to an unexpected partnership. A friend's forgiving words when we mess up and gossip about them that leads to a deeper friendship. A parent we forgive for not being there when we were growing up, who becomes a wonderful giving grandparent. And forgiveness isn't some touchy-feely experience. In the past decade, science has shown the physical benefits of forgiveness to our cardiovascular systems, blood pressure, and stress levels. Apparently, forgiveness is not only good for the soul, it's good for the heart. And yet, in my travels around the country, I so often hear about the hurts that won't go away. Siblings who haven't spoken to each other in years, who don't even remember why. Parents and children who can't sit in the same room because of resentments. Ex-spouses who speak contemptuously about each other a decade after they've split up. We know forgiveness is important, but why is it so difficult to forgive? Well, we were actually the first culture in history to focus almost exclusively on how we can forgive others for what they do to us. None of the great wisdom traditions, Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, focus on how we can forgive others. They all focus on our asking to be forgiven. The great spiritual traditions understood that our ability to forgive other people depends on how forgiven we feel. The more forgiven we feel, the more forgiving we can be. After all, we can't give away what we don't really have. The spiritual truth is to be a master at forgiving others. We need to become masters of asking to be forgiven. The 12th century sage Maimonides taught that asking for forgiveness is actually a process, and when we practice this process, we wind up feeling forgiven. I call Maimonides' process the 4 R's. We need to recognize what we did, regret that we did it, resolve to never do it again, and repair what we did. Well, recently I had the opportunity to use this process with my younger daughter, Talia. Talia's a night owl just like me. When everyone else in our home is asleep, Talia is watching TV or playing on the computer until after midnight in the one common room we can hang out in. These late hours could have been a time of closeness between father and daughter. We could have talked into the night or at least kept each other company as we did our own thing, but for some reason it just annoyed me that Talia was up during what I thought should be my private time after a long day. And almost nightly I'd hassle her about going to sleep, which she quietly just ignored. Well, one evening after a particularly stressful day at work, my frustration got the best of me and I lost it, and I just yelled at her, "Can't you go to sleep already? Why don't you read a book in bed? You won't be able to focus in school." I could see her crumble, you know, the way our kids often do when we underestimate how sensitive they are and how powerful we are. And through her tears, with a quivering voice, she said to me, "What's your problem? I'm not bothering you, and I'm a straight-A student, and I never miss the bus. Why are you so mean?" I felt terrible, and I apologized profusely. But much as I hate to admit it, over the next few weeks, I repeatedly lost it, and after one more apology, Talia nailed me. "Don't say you're sorry anymore. Just stop yelling at me." And then for good measure, she said, "And I'm going to write a letter to all your students telling them you're not such a spiritual guy." Clearly, sorry was not good enough. Forgiveness demanded a more serious process. I needed to practice the 4 R's. And so I sat with what I did. And after a few days of soul-searching, I recognized that screaming at Talia was obviously not about Talia at all. As the eldest of 6 brothers, I was never alone growing up. I shared a room, and like in many big families, I was often responsible for my younger siblings. There was always someone around. You couldn't even use the bathroom without someone knocking on the door. And I resented the lack of privacy. As an adult, I still wanted my own space, and there was innocent Talia, the object of my childhood resentment. Well, here was the first stage of a genuine process of forgiveness. I recognized where my temper was coming from. Getting angry at Talia had nothing to do with Talia. I was burdening her with the baggage of my own childhood. That night, after what had been a few days of chilliness between us, I explained all this to her. I explained to her what I realized about my losing my temper and how much I regretted what I had done. And she listened with genuine interest to stories from my childhood. I could see she understood and that she had compassion for me, her father. Now was time for resolve. I had to show her that I could act differently, and only then would reconciliation be possible. Well, I'm happy to report that as of now, things have gone pretty well. Talia's still at the computer or in front of the TV late at night, and I still long for the time alone, but the edge is gone. And recently, she was reading by my side on the couch, and she looked up at me and said, "Now, Dad, isn't this better?" We both laughed. That's reconciliation. The forgiveness process, it strengthened our relationship. And of course, knowing that I could get angry at my daughter and actually make her cry for reasons that I was not conscious of and that had nothing to do with her, makes me much more forgiving of other people when they have their outbursts of anger. And being forgiven by Talia, even though she had no ironclad guarantee I wouldn't lash out again, reminded me that forgiving someone else is always an act of faith and hope in people. In other words, really going through the process of recognizing, regretting, resolving, and repairing, and then being forgiven, we realize that we're not bad people, but that sometimes we do bad things because we are unaware. And realizing this about ourselves makes it easier for us to forgive others. Most contemporary teachings on forgiveness tell us that forgiveness is an internal process. It doesn't even require the other person. If we just have the right attitude, we can let go of the hurt and resentment. But letting go is something we can only do after we've exhausted the forgiveness process. Because the forgiveness we actually yearn for is that the damaged relationship will somehow, in however small way, be made better. And this requires that we move towards the person who has hurt us, not away. I call this the sacred messiness of forgiveness. A few years back, I heard an amazing story about a woman named Susan. Susan's teenage son was murdered in a drive-by killing. The killer, who was the same age as her own child, was found and convicted and sentenced. And after the verdict was announced, Susan stood up and stared directly at the young man as he was being taken away and screamed, "I'm going to kill you." About a year later, Susan went to visit her son's murderer. She just needed to confront him directly. He had been living on the street before the killing, and actually Susan was the only visitor he had that year. They talked, and she wound up visiting him again. And at the end of his 3 years of incarceration, she asked him what he would be doing. He was confused and had nowhere to go. Susan offered to help him get a job and to let him stay in a spare room she had. And for 8 months, he ate her food and slept in her home. One evening, Susan, with great seriousness, asked him to sit down and said to him, "Do you remember what I said to you the day you were convicted of murdering my son?" The young man nervously nodded. "Yes, you said you were going to kill me." "Well, I did," said Susan. "I did not want the boy who could kill my son for no reason to remain alive on this earth. I wanted him to die. And that old boy is gone now. So now I want to ask you, since my son's gone and that killer is gone, if you'll stay here, I've got room, and I'd like to adopt you if you want." Susan became the mother of her son's killer, the mother he never had. You see, Susan understood that forgiveness is not simply about feeling better or letting go. Forgiveness does not mean condoning or making everything all better. That sort of expectation actually keeps us from forgiving. Forgiveness is a process, an art and practice that flows from our deep intuition that relationships are always worth trying to restore because life is about learning how to love. Forgiveness converts the hurt into new depths of awareness, and with awareness, anything is possible. In fact, we discover the part of us that trusts and hopes and loves despite it all, our forgiving self, that gives truth to the saying, to err is human, and to forgive is divine.